Hi, this is Stu Stover again. We're going to do Civil Rights Part 2. So one of the things that happened, Johnson, president, passes civil rights legislation. Well, is it enough just to have a civil rights legislation to say thou shalt not discriminate anymore? No, you had to have mechanisms to try and make that happen. So one of the primary mechanisms was something called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So it was a very small federal agency tasked with making sure that companies more broadly across America, it could have been government, it could have been, pick an issue, doesn't really matter, would comply with the broad directives of the civil rights movement. All right, so part of what's going on here is they're not very big, they don't have a lot of lawyers, so they can't bring a lot of cases, but they can pass those cases off to private attorneys if they think there's merit, but they don't necessarily want to take the case for, whatever reason. So the EEOC had the task of saying, we've got to create a society where everybody has equal opportunities. Okay, that's fair. Some people obviously were not at all happy with what the EEOC was doing, but one of the examples the EEOC would use, and I had a couple EEOC lawyers show up in my class and do a presentation on this, so I've heard a bit about sort of the old days of how they framed this stuff, but they said it's like you've got a white male running a race against all these other groups. Well, the white male has great equipment, great shoes, they've had great training, they've got great nutrition, they're ready to go. They've done what they need to do to get there. And then you've got the other groups that may or may not have the proper equipment, or may have, in the case of some groups, might have sandals instead of running shoes or whatever else. And what their argument is that the race was not fair. Well, it wasn't fair because various groups didn't have the same advantages that in fact white males may well have had. That feels a little funny to say it that way today, but in those days there was some sentiment that made sense. And so the idea was to try and level the field a bit. Now, one of the expressions they used is that we're running a race and you've got, this African American who's trying to run the race, and not only do they have bad equipment and bad shoes, but they have a ball and chain around their leg, which makes it very hard for them to run that race and be successful. Again, the language of the day was kind of the way this worked. And so they were charged with making sure that there was no discrimination. Well, are white males a protected class also? Sure they are. And so if there was an organization that was discriminating against white males, EEOC could and did go after those organizations and say, you got to have a level playing field for everybody. Okay, so the notion here was making sure that the disadvantaged populations, whatever they were, Native Americans, various ethnic groups, African American, pick group in America back in that era, and they wanted to make sure that they had at least had a chance to get in the game, both economically and otherwise. And so, let me give you an example. Did it mean white females needed to have some advantages passed their way also? And the answer was sure. And so what we've seen, and this is in some ways a topic for another discussion, but somewhere, and it's really hard to figure out the numbers, but the average white female today makes somewhere between 80 and 90% of what a white male does. Is that hugely better than what it was in the 1950s? You bet. Are there some reasons why we're still in this category and it's not 100%? Yeah, it's a topic for another discussion anyway. So the EEOC was going after whatever groups were disadvantaged in the system and trying to give them an advantage. Now, did that mean that we were supposed to take unqualified minorities and put them in positions where they, were clearly not able to do the job? And the answer was, well, that may have happened sometimes. Most of the time it did not, because you had something called a BFOQ. BFOQ, one of the critical rules within the EEOC, a bona fide occupational qualification. So the idea is, if you've got a job, then there are requirements for that job. So a job may require a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, or a job may require lifting 100 pounds. Okay, and the short answer was, organizations that had rules that say you got to be able to lift 100 pounds, many of them did, they put those rules in place to make sure you didn't have females getting into the workplace. And so what did the court say when that was challenged? Why would you expect anybody to lift 100 pounds? Get a machine, you idiot. And so the idea was you had all these barriers that kept various groups out of certain kinds of jobs, certain kind of professions. Okay. So BFOQ was really important. So was it legitimate? Okay, so today, one of the issues that's showing up is we say for all kinds of jobs, you got to have a bachelor's degree. Well, the question is, do you really need a bachelor's degree for that job? Or is that just a way to keep certain kinds of people out of the pool that could be employees and doing that particular job? So let me give you a couple examples of what happened over the years on this one. And some of these are early. 60s, early 70s. So the airlines, okay, some of you know this, but the airlines used to require stewardesses, okay, they're no longer called stewardess, they're flight attendants, but back in the day they were stewardesses, required them to leave the profession when they hit 32. Too old, Well, what, 32? And so the short answer was, what was going on in the 60s, most airline travelers were business professionals. What did business professionals want? Surprise, surprise, they wanted young, attractive stewardesses to take care of them. And so when the stewardesses challenged this in court, the airline said, oh, we're not discriminatory. We don't do it. No, it's just our customer's preference. And the court said, customer preference is not a BFOQ. You can't use that. And all of a sudden, the 32 kind of went away, and you had older stewardesses on the airlines. Well, actually, is there a BFOQ for a stewardess? And the answer is sure. You got to be a certain weight. Can you imagine a 250-pound stewardess trying to get up and down the aisles and take care of everybody? Nah, probably not. And so the issue was they had to figure out legitimate ways to say, here are the requirements for the job, and we don't care if you're black or blue or green or purple. None of that matters. What matters, can you do the job? Can you meet the requirements for that? So a second one was there was a power plant down in North Carolina. Well, what they had is a system where they had very few minorities when the bulk of the population was minority. Okay, and why would that matter? The power company typically had much better wages than virtually anybody else, and so they were sort of saving those jobs for the white members of that community. And so somebody filed a case against the utility, saying that why does a janitor have to have a bachelor's degree? Or I think it was actually a high school diploma. Didn't matter. I mean, could have been either. And so when they went through the court case, the courts went, so why is it that you have this BFOQ that somebody has to have this level of educational attainment? Okay. And they couldn't come up with a good answer, except what it did is it kept most of the African American population that was less educated than certainly the white population was, keep them out of the jobs. And so the courts went, nope, can't do that one. So they threw that out. And there's a ton of other examples. And I'm not, we don't have time to get into all the examples of how we created this system. And we don't have time to get into all the reasons why we have such backlash that has showed up as a result of this. Okay. So one of the things that we look at here is the rule basically says you've got a location for your organization, whatever it is, a business, a school, a government, doesn't matter. And you draw a circle on the map and say people, say 20, 25 miles away could potentially be employees of your company. All right. And so then you look at, does your population in some fashion represent your community? So the idea here is that you've got a pool of potential workers and your community should reflect that. Okay, that's the Detroit Police Department example, is that you draw that circle, 50-60% of the population is African American, yet we don't have any officers. Okay, that might be a problem. So what do? You create an affirmative action plan, and again, I'm talking old days here. And the plan says over the next 5 years, whatever, we are going to address this and try and reduce, not fix, but reduce the inequities and the discrimination, the profile of our employees against the broader community. Okay, so 5 years, you work on that. It was 0 before. At the end of 5 years, it's 20%. Okay, 20% is still not 60%, but is it better? Sure. And the issue is you can't always solve these problems very quickly. So what do? At the end of 5 years, that plan goes away and you create a new one. This time it might be, we don't have any white females as officers. And it would be a good idea to have some white females in our system. And so then the 5-year plan might be addressing that. The next one might be saying, well, we got all these minorities and other groups now in our organization, but they're all frontline workers. We don't have any management that is one of those groups. And so you got to address the question of maybe getting some mobility up the organization with various groups. And so, it was simply a relatively simple plan or process to start to address the problems and making sure that the organization was reflective of the community. We had lots of language and, theory on this, that in fact, diverse organizations were better than homogeneous organizations. All right, I'm not going to argue any of that stuff at the moment, but the idea is to try and make more opportunities for people. Now, when you look at this picture, you would think there's a ton of discrimination against white males, and there was some, but yet who still makes the most money? Who still has the most power in most organizations? And the answer is white males. So they didn't get hammered all that hard. They still did just fine for those who were skilled and qualified and met the BFO, all of that stuff ended up being part of the deal. Well, not always. So let me give you a negative example here, guys. And for the most part, I'm a believer in this stuff. I think it makes sense to create a more open society, whatever. But I did some teaching at the state prison in Jackson for a while for the community college. And one of my friends there was a recreation director. So his job was to make it easier for the boys to be out there on the softball field and the volleyball court and the basketball court and get whatever equipment that they needed, do all that kind of stuff. He was told, because he was not technically, he wasn't a guard, so he was told that if a fight breaks out, here's your whistle, blow your whistle. Okay, because then a guard would come and deal with it. because he wasn't supposed to. And so one day he's out there and they're playing softball or whatever, fight breaks out, blows his whistle. This young 95-pound, happened to be African-American female, shows up and says, "Sir, can I help you?" So she had not a clue that there was fight going on out there. And so he picks up his whistle and he blows his whistle again. Well, is it appropriate to have token African-American females in a male prison who have to deal with those kinds of problems? And the answer is probably not. That was probably an abuse of this whole system to put unqualified folks in there. Now, I would argue that a legitimate BFOQ for a guard is you got to be able to have the physical attributes to be able to restrain prisoners, do what needs to be done at some level, although if that's the whole point, we've kind of violated what we think of as a guard. So when you think about this whole process, which groups have been most advantaged by the legacy of EEOC and the Civil Rights Movement? And the answer is, of course, African Americans have had hugely more advantages and have become integrated in a far more reasonable way across American society. Have we solved the problem yet? Probably not, but there's systemic issues that also affect that one in terms of education and all sorts of other issues that may show up. Chinese, Asians have just skyrocketed in terms of these numbers and the opportunities that they have had. Other groups have done remarkably well. But the group that has probably done the best are white females. Surprise, surprise. And they now are able to do virtually anything they want to do. And wages have gone up substantially for them. And the difference is still there. I mean, there's some gap between white male wages, white female wages, but for the most part, it's getting reasonably close. So the question is, which group has really advantaged the most? I would argue white males are the ones who have been advantaged the most, because who tends to be married to white females? And so what we've created in the 1950s, you tended to have a white male head of house who went off to worked a dangerous, sometimes boring, monotonous, routine job, made enough money to cover the expenses of the house, of the household. And if the wife went to work, it was more pin money. Okay, I've used the term before. Pin money simply means that it's not a whole heck of a lot of money, but what it is, it's a little extra. So you can go on a vacation, or you can have better Christmas, or whatever the issue is that you want to use this extra money for. Well, American society has changed a lot. Is it easy to have a one breadwinner in the house anymore? No, the answer is we need two adults in most houses to make the kind of money to live the kind of lifestyle we want. And so this has been enormously helpful for changing society in better ways, okay, to get where we want to go. So why do we have so much anger against DEI today in America? Well, it looks like we have tipped the scales toward certain minority groups. And obviously this is viewed by many people as a zero-sum game, which means if one group wins, then some other group has to lose. I don't think that's the case at all, but that's the way a lot of folks would frame this. And so they see DEI as threatening the very fabric of what makes American capitalism, which is, you stand on your own 2 feet, you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you demonstrate your level of competence, and you get where you want to go regardless of all these silly rules. So the threat, the victimness of some, not all, some white males have seen this as particularly threatening, and threatening to what they perceived as the traditional culture of America. And it's complicated stuff, guys, and I don't mean to simplify it too much because that's hardly fair. But to simply take D, E, and I and pitch it out as if it's somehow evil, as many folks in Congress right now and our federal government seem to treat this, and some states as well too, seems dumb to me. There are essential good things in this about what we want to create as a society. But remember, it's always about BFOQs. It's making sure you have qualified folks in those positions. That's really important. And so for what it's worth, we will do more discussion around DEI, because obviously it's a very hot issue, front burner issue in America right now, and trying to sort out exactly what makes sense, where we want to go, how we're going to make our society the kind of society we want, really matters a lot. So for what it's worth, that gives you a little history and a little context, hopefully, in terms of what we're doing and why.